Hi students, today I'm going to be reading to you from our close reader from the story, The Most Daring of Our Leaders. Now, this is the third story that you're going to have read in our unit, Guided by a Cause. So as you're reading through this and listening to this being read, I want you to continue to think about how this particular story connects with our essential questions. What types of things were these groups of students trying to unite behind to try and change society? So this particular story is written by Lynn Olson. She's going to be talking about the perspective of a woman named Diane Nash, who is moving from Chicago to attend a university in Nashville, Tennessee in 1959. Now, if you remember anything about this time period, you know it was kind of a crazy time period during the Civil Rights Movement. So there were a lot of issues going on with equality in connection with civil rights and things such as that. So as you're listening, be keeping these things in the back of your mind. From The Most Daring of Our Leaders, history written by Lynn Olson. Nash's moment of epiphany came at the Tennessee State Fair in 1959. She had gone to the fair on a date and wanted to use the ladies' room. She found two. One marked white women, the other colored women. And for the first time in her life, she suffered the degradation of Jim Crow. Now, pausing for a second, if you're not familiar with Jim Crow, these were the laws that severely limited African Americans during this time period. And even though these laws were not exactly lawful, they were still practiced by a large portion of our country. Going back in. This was no longer an intellectual exercise. She was being told in the most searing way imaginable that she was beyond the pale, unfit to use the same facilities as white women. Outraged by the experience, she was even more upset that her date, a Southerner, did not share her fury. Neither did most of her fellow Fisk students. They did not seem to care that they could shop at the downtown stores, but not eat at the store's lunch counters, or that they had to sit in the balcony to see a movie. The more Nash found out about segregation in Nashville, the more she felt stifled and boxed in. In the rest of the country, Nashville had a reputation of being more radically progressive than most southern cities. Blacks could vote in Nashville. The city's schools and buses were integrated. Blacks served on the police force, fire department, city council, and board of education. But segregation still firmly ruled in theaters, restaurants, hotels, libraries, and Diane Nash, in a deep dying moralist, decided then and there that Nashville was in a stage of sin. She couldn't believe that the children of my classmates would have to be born into a society where they had to believe that they were inferior. Above all, she could not believe that her classmates were willing to let that happen. Since they did not seem to share her anger, she looked elsewhere for support. Paul LaPrade, a white exchange student at Fisk, told her about a black minister named James Lawson, who was training college students in the use of nonviolence as a framework for an all-out attack on segregation. For Lawson, who had spent 3 years in India studying the principles of Gandhi, nonviolence was more than just a protest technique. It was the means by which he ordered his life. The young minister talked about the power of nonviolent confrontation with evil, about overcoming the forces of hate and transforming society through love and forgiveness. At first, Nash was skeptical. How could such high-flown idealism be harnessed as a weapon against gun-toting sheriffs and club-swinging racists? Even after attending several of Lawson's workshops, she still was sure this stuff is never going to work. But since, as she said, it was the only game in town, she kept going back. And after weeks of studying theology and philosophy, of reading Thoreau and other advocates of passive resistance, of discussion and arguments with the workshop's other participants, the intense young woman from Chicago was finally captured by Lawson's vision. She was particularly drawn to his belief that to be effective, these young activists would have to transcend self-hatred and a sense of inferiority, that they would have to learn to love themselves. Having been raised in a milieu that downplays her blackness, she now found herself part of a group suddenly proud to be called black. Within the movement, we came to a realization of our own worth. In the late fall of 1959, the students at Lawson's workshop formed a central committee to act as the decision-making body for the group. Nash, who had impressed everyone with her clear-eyed thinking and intensity of developing commitment to nonviolence, was named to the committee. More and more, the students were turning to her as one of their main leaders. The committee had chosen the lunch counters and restaurants of Nashville's downtown stores as the target of the students' first protest, scheduled for February 1960. For the next several months, the students underwent rigorous training to prepare for the upcoming sit-ins, and on February 13th, 124 students left a Nashville church and made their way to the lunch counters of several downtown stores. There, they took their seats and asked for service. The men wore suits and ties. The women, dresses, stockings, and high heels. They were poised and polite and gave little outward sign of the fear that many of them felt. Diane Nash, for one, was terrified, a terror that would never leave her, no matter how many sit-ins and protests she would participate in afterwards. As frightened as the students were during that first sit-in, however, they had to struggle to keep from laughing at the stunned, panicky reactions of the white store workers and patrons, who acted, Nash recalled, as if these well-dressed young people were some dreadful monster, about to devour them all. Waitresses dropped dishes, cashiers broke down in tears. An elderly white woman almost had a seizure when she opened the door of the store's white ladies' room and found two black women inside. There were no arrests and no violence. After a couple of hours, the students left the store, jubilant that their first foray had gone without a hitch. The second sit-in was planned for the following week. In the meantime, several members of the Student Central Committee came to Nash and asked her to head the group. She was hardworking and outwardly fearless, and she did not seem to have the ego problems that a lot of the men had. Because she was a woman and not a man, I think Diane never had to go around and do any posturing, said Bernard Lafayette, an American Baptist college student and one of the Nashville movement's leaders. But Nash had no desire to become the recognized head of this movement. Like most young women of that time, she had been raised to stay in the background. The men pressured her into accepting, however, and when she returned to her dorm room, she was so frightened by what she had done that she could hardly keep her legs from collapsing under her. "This is Tennessee," she told herself. "We are going to be coming up against white Southern men who are 40 and 50 and 60 years old, who are politicians and judges and owners of businesses, and I'm 22 years old. What am I doing? And how is this little group of students my age going to stand up to these powerful people?" Once again, she managed to damp down her fear. She joined the other students in the second sit-in, which was quite quietly successful as the first. Nevertheless, the city was losing its patience. Nashville officials, deluged by complaints from store owners and that the sit-ins were causing whites to stay away from downtown, warned the students not to continue. If the warning wasn't heeded, they made clear the kids could forget about being treated with kid gloves any longer. Worried about the possibility of violence and arrest, the ministers connected with the movement urged the students to reconsider their plans for another demonstration on February 27th. With the numbers swelling and the young people refused, in the middle of another snowstorm, more than 300 of them poured into downtown Nashville. No sooner had some of them sat down at the Woolsworth lunch counter than the minister's fears proved justified. The demonstrators were met by an opposing force of cursing young white toughs, who yanked them from their stools and threw them on the floor, beat them with fists and clubs, kicked them, spat on them, extinguished lighted cigarettes on their backs and in their hair. The police were nowhere in sight, and when they finally arrived, they approached not the white attackers, but the bruised and shaken demonstrators, who were spattered with mustard and ketchup, spit, and blood. "Okay, get up from the lunch counters or we're going to arrest you," one of the cops barked. When no one obeyed, the students were ordered to their feet, arrested for disorderly conduct, and marched out, through a gauntlet of hostile whites, to police paddy wagons. When they looked over their shoulders at the lunch counters, they saw a new wave of students quietly moving in to take their place. So as we wrap this up, please continue to think about what exactly these students were trying to prove. What were they trying to change in society by doing things such as these lunch counter sit-ins?